QSO Today, episode 464, Frank Brickle, AB2KT, reprise. This episode of QSO Today is listener-sponsored. Only you can keep the QSO Today podcast coming to you every weekend since 2014. Please become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor banner on the show notes page or at the top of the QSOtoday.com webpage. There were no donations or new sponsors this last week, causing my puppy to be sad that the future of the QSO Today podcast may have run its course. Now we have no commercial sponsors and depend on you, my dear listeners, for keeping this project alive. Please become a listener sponsor today. Thanks to John Lockhart, W0DC, for funding the transcription of episode 365, Tony DiParto, WA4JQS. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. Tickets for $15 are on sale now for the QSO Today Academy event, coming on the weekend of September 9th and 10th, 2023. We have over 25 amazing presentations to fill your weekend. All of them will be available for listener sponsors and ticket holders for 30 days after the event. So even if you're busy that weekend, you can still enjoy this content. Please click on the ticket banner on this week's show notes page. Dr. Frank Brickle, AB2KT, was my guest in episode 212 in August of 2018, 5 years ago. He is both a musical composer and a technology expert. He earned a Ph.D. in music from Princeton University and has been involved in computer science and signal processing since 1970. He was an early pioneer in the development of software-defined radio for the U.S. government and later for private industry, and was the co-developer of PowerSDR software, used by Flex Radio, with Bob McGwier and 4HY. Frank is also a classical music composer and has written compositions performed worldwide. AB2KT is my QSO Today in this remastered audio version of the original interview. AB2KT, this is Eric 4Z1UG. Are you there, Frank?
Hey, Eric, how are you?
I'm great, Frank. Thanks so much for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
I think I was 11 years old, and for some reason I managed to wander into a radio store in Pennsylvania somewhere. I think it was Scranton, Pennsylvania. I don't even remember exactly why, and the gear just looked cool. It just looked wonderful, and basically it was a bunch of holocrafters, receivers, and things like that. So I grabbed some of the information sheets and took them home, and they sat there for probably a year. And then I do as I usually do, which is go to the library and kind of buried my head in everything I could find out about it, and discovered that there was, to my surprise, that there was no age limit on being licensed as an amateur radio operator. So at age 12, and also I should point out my father at that time had an office in New York City at 30 Church Street, which was right around the corner from Radio Row. So I mentioned this to him, and I mean he was an engineer. He was very much in favor of my getting involved in this kind of thing. So he got one of the old Amico code practice LPs, and I started learning Morse and got the ARRL manual for the novice licensing. And so I was first licensed at age 12. And then in those days, the novice license was only good for a year, so I had to work pretty hard to get my code speed up to 13 words a minute and study for the technical part of the examination. And I was licensed as a general at age 13, which would have been 1964.
Wow. So in 1963, you got your novice.
That's right.
And what was your first call sign then?
It was WN2GRK, Golf Romeo Kilo. And then it became WB2, Golf Romeo Kilo.
And did you have any mentors or Elmers that helped you along, or was your father primarily the guy that pushed you through?
He taught me most of the technical stuff. So, for example, I mean, he was a mechanical engineer, but he had studied a lot of electrical engineering. So he taught me that stuff. As far as the practical issues were concerned, there were two people in the town where I was living at the time, which was Tenafly in New Jersey. And one of them was a wonderful man named Bert Holge, W2TQS, who helped me a great deal. And he was also the one who administered the novice exam to me. And there was another guy in town. His name was Joe Bensler, and I have been trying to remember or look up his call sign ever since we arranged to have this conversation. And for some reason, I can't remember it. But, I mean, he also was extremely helpful to me. So there were those two.
You know, perhaps there's a listener who'll remember Joe's. So what was your first rig?
It was a DX40 Heathkit and a Hammerland HQ110A. And then when I got my general, I added the ICO, what was it, 7-something VFO. And one of the things very early on that I developed an appetite for was experimenting with antennas. So I just went through a whole mess of different sort of antennas, starting out originally when I was a novice just with the usual 40-meter dipole. And then various kinds of end-fed antennas. At some point, I built a homebrew L-match, which was an interesting thing to learn to use because I didn't have an SWR meter. So I had to figure out some way to figure out when it was at resonance. And that, I felt like, was my first major technical accomplishment, was figuring out how to do that.
And what did you do? Did you use a light bulb or some kind of a... Did you make your own SWR meter?
No, not at all. Basically, it was a combination of things. I figured out how to tune it close to resonance simply by maximizing the noise, combination of moving the tap around and just tweaking the cap, and then a field strength meter, a little field strength meter, to then just optimize from there. And it worked fine. It worked great. I wouldn't want to do it with any of the current rigs, but with one of those old Heathkit tank circuits, it was fine.
And what mode did you like to operate? I mean, obviously as a novice you were operating CW, but once you got your general, did you stay on CW?
Absolutely, yeah. And that's true to this day. I mean, I absolutely love Morse. I love listening to it. I love using it. And even at that time, that sort of sparked an interest, a parallel interest in maritime radio history. So I find all of that and kind of the romance of CW just to be really intoxicating to this day.
David Sarnoff was one of your heroes growing up then. He was the young man that received the Titanic's distress message and went on to found RCA.
Right. What I was thinking of was that, his... what shall I call him? Sort of one of his major victims after he became an industrialist was Edwin Armstrong, of course. And there was a big tower. I live not far from the huge tower up on the Palisades in New Jersey that Armstrong had put up and was used for the first experiments in FM broadcasting. So I was taught to think of Sarnoff as being kind of a bad guy because of how badly he screwed Armstrong.
So Armstrong might have been one of your heroes.
For sure. Oh, there was one other person, actually, I should mention, because I did get involved in races in that town that I was living in. And he was an engineer for AT&T. Again, I don't remember his call sign. His name is Willard Felch. And he was very good to us local kids because there was a lot of 2-meter gear that was associated with the basically anticipating some sort of nuclear disaster. There were a lot of the Gonset 2 and 6 meter rigs sitting down in the shelter in the school, and he used to let us take them out and experiment with different kinds of configurations all over the town to get some kind of nice saturation of coverage. So he was another guy, and he was very good to us also.
Well, being licensed at 13, did you have a number of contemporaries then that were your age, that were your ham radio friends, maybe throughout high school?
Yeah, for sure. That was at the really lowest point of the sunspot cycle. And what it meant, among other things, was that 15 meters was completely abandoned. There was nobody on it at all. And there was a crew of sort of adolescents and teenagers all over the place in northeastern New Jersey there who used to talk on 15-meter phone every night for a long time. It was, as I say, there was nobody else on the band at all. And surprisingly, the ground wave was pretty good. So I think we probably had about a 50-mile radius, reliable range of contact. So yeah, that I got to know a lot of the local hams, the kids at that time, and to this day it's funny because that was, and this is more important than you might think. That's how I got acquainted with Gene Shepard, K2ORS, because everybody who was on 15-meter phone, all the kids would listen to Gene Shepard every night, and of course, he was a ham, and that also was an extremely important thing to me. Was kind of get aware of the world from listening to Shepard, and I owe that directly to all of my ham friends.
And did that create a love for the oral story then as well?
Absolutely.
He was a master, Gene.
He was incredible that way. Absolutely incredible. I still go back and listen to a number of his old shows, and it's amazing how many of them I remember in detail from those days.
And it's amazing that those shows are available now on the internet. As is everything else, is available on the internet. But it's nice to be able to find them and to play them even here. Did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career?
I thought it would. In the end, it turned out not doing that. At least not at the... No, actually, it really didn't have much to do with it at all. I expected, because of all this background, I expected to be a student of math and science and go on to some sort of technical career, either engineering or something else. I wound up not going to the local high school, but instead going to a prep school in New York City, which made things a little different. When I got there, I discovered an appetite for classical languages and things like that. So I wound up studying Latin and Greek and a number of other things, and didn't really have an awful lot of time for technical studies at that point. And so at the time, it seemed like what I was doing was sending me off in a completely different direction that was totally unrelated to ham radio. And by the time I went to university, I really didn't have the time to be on the air, to be doing much of anything associated with radio. However, what it did mean was that, and this was one of the other advantages of being in that high school, was we had pretty much free access to the computer at Fordham University, which was an old IBM 1420. So I started learning to program at that point, and a lot of the technical stuff, or I should call it comfort with technical stuff that I had acquired from being licensed and being active in ham radio, rolled over pretty naturally into work with the computer. So I kind of had these two things going on in parallel. I mean, I was sort of a student of classical languages, and I figured, changing plans, I was probably going to wind up, at least for a lot of the time, I was going to wind up being a writer. And also programming the computer, simply because it came pretty easily to me. And there was nobody else going to do it for you. You had to do it yourself in those days. There were no canned applications.
Were you punching cards?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. And learning to do that was probably the most frustrating part of the whole thing.
Well, you stuck with it. I gave it up because I just wanted a quick return on my investment, and I couldn't wait 2 hours for the paper to run.
Yeah.
To find out I had a syntax error on line 10.
Yes. Well, I think it would have been different if we had to submit decks of cards to people behind a desk to run them. I mean, most of the time we'd had to operate the machine ourselves, so the turnaround on the disastrous mistakes was pretty quick.
Oh, no, I had to submit my deck of cards to somebody behind the desk. Maybe that was the difference.
I think so.
I gave it up.
I think so.
I gave it up.
Yep.
It wasn't for me, but I'm glad it wasn't. It was for you, because obviously you went on to do some other things. So what happened after that?
Well, I mean, there's another twist as far as my high school career is concerned, and that is that I had started playing the piano when I was 7, and I really wasn't considering. I mean, I was a pretty good player, but I wasn't considering doing it professionally or anything like that. And then, through a series of kind of accidents, it occurred to me that again, this name might mean something to people or it might not. The New York State Arts Council used to send Juilliard students around all the high schools in New York City and have them play and just expose kids to something other than the usual run of popular music. So one day this piano trio came to my school, and among other things what they played was a piece by a friend of theirs. And I remember this is probably 1966 or 67. They played a piece by a friend of theirs named Philip Glass, who was a fellow student. And if anybody who's marginally conversant in contemporary music will know that Philip Glass is, at this point, one of the most famous composers in the world. And I said, wait a minute. You mean people are actually still writing music for piano trios and things like that? And I mean, it was instantaneous. That was the point at which I decided, that's absolutely what I have to do. And so, I mean, that moment kind of determined the rest of my life.
Did you go on to Juilliard?
No, I went to Princeton. I did all my degrees at Princeton, and the reason for that, among other things, was that it was at the time probably the best graduate school for composition in the world, and it was a center for all kinds of things musically. And again, I didn't find this out until I got there. It was also one of the centers for computer music and the extremely early stages of digital signal processing. So that's where the technical background and experience with the computer merged with everything else that I was interested in. So for the period of time that I was there, which was the sort of the bachelor's through the Ph.D., I mean, I was enormously immersed in doing signal processing and computer music, and with some of the foundational people in the field, and one of the few places where you could do it pretty much to your heart's content.
And were you composing at that time?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I mean, that's when I decided that's what I wanted to do. I started doing immediately. I wrote a Broadway style musical in my senior year, and haven't stopped since then.
You're still a composer, and you're a composer of operatic music. What piece or what composition is in your mind, your best work?
My best work, actually, I think it's the one I just finished. I mean, I don't always say that, but in this case, yeah, it's a song cycle for mezzo-soprano and guitar that uses texts, a whole bunch of texts in German and French that have already been set by extremely famous people like Brahms and Schumann and Hugo Wolf. So this is really a sort of a wise-ass thing to do, is to take these texts and put them together in a single song cycle. But I managed to sort of bring together a lot of things that I've been working towards for about 20 years in terms of control of harmonic motion and the kind of blending of the instrumental support with the singer. So yeah, it's really pretty good. It's going to be premiered in New York in October.
That's not what I'm seeing on YouTube right now, because you actually have a series of videos on YouTube with soprano and a guitar. Yeah,
this is written for those people. The things that are on YouTube are just individual songs that I had written for them. But this is sort of a much larger piece that they commissioned. Yeah.
What are you calling that, so that we know what to look for in the future?
It's called Song Cycle in the Form of 32 Variations. I mean, as far as the thing. Okay, I was just going to say, in terms of the pieces that you can find easily on the internet, I think probably one that will appeal to people a lot is the little puppet opera, The Creation of the World and Fall of the Angels. All
you have to do is put Frank Brickle into YouTube. You get a lot of returns of people performing your music, and it's very cool.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate your giving me the opportunity to sort of wave the flag for all of this. That's great. Thank you.
When you Google Frank Brickle AB2KT, there are a lot of references to you and SDR, software-defined radio. Can we start? Yep. I mean, I have a sense, based on what you did at Princeton, maybe how this kind of evolved, but can we start at the beginning of your SDR story, and how did it begin?
Yeah, actually, the beginning of it is kind of a continuation of what we were talking about a moment ago. Most people who have my background, my educational background in music wind up being professors of music someplace or other. And I knew that I didn't want to do that. I mean, I just sort of had no appetite for spending the rest of my life in an academic institution. So it wasn't really sure exactly how I was planning to support myself, because it's really hard to do that starting out as a composer. And through a combination of, again, almost accidents, I wound up, because of the technical skills and everything else, I wound up getting an invitation to come to work on the research staff of an organization called the Center for Communications Research in Princeton. And one of the great things about this place was that it was understood that you were going to devote a certain proportion of your time to doing your own work, which in my case was composition, as well as working on their problems. And nobody ever stipulated exactly what the proportion of time was. Basically, the way you were evaluated was in terms of the kinds of contributions you made over a span of about 5 years. And beyond that, there was no management at all. The specific task of this organization, the Center for Communications Research, was to do research and technology development and transfer on problems related to secure communications, which basically means codes and ciphers, but it also refers to things like siphony, which is encrypted speech, pretty much any of that stuff. And it involved a lot of signal processing, a lot of combinatorial mathematics, again, all stuff which was sort of right down my alley. So I was there for 17 years. I left in 2000, actually, just before 9/11. One of the consequences of that was that the sponsor of this organization was the U.S. Department of Defense, and we were encouraged to stick our fingers into whatever interesting problems we could find. And one of the most interesting sorts of problems for me personally, towards the sort of the latter half of my time there, was a group of people who were actually doing the very first work in fieldable software radio for a lot of reasons. But my first exposure to it was in people who were developing systems for RF surveillance, so to be collecting broadband samples, extracting channels, doing real-time decryption. I got very seriously involved in all of those problems, and again, it was sort of like the early days of the computer. I mean, there was nothing. If you wanted to do that, the only thing you could possibly do was write the programs yourself. So that's what I did, and because I had this background in signal processing and quite a few other things, and not coincidentally with issues involving real-time programming, because those are very lively issues in real-time musical performance in computers. It was just a very natural fit. That's kind of what I wound up doing. I wound up actually writing code for software-defined radios, fieldable software-defined radios, as part of my work. And it was unfortunate because for the period of the last 5 years or so, it got more and more difficult for me to do both things, to do the technical work and do my own musical work, which wasn't helped by the fact that I was kind of in the doldrums musically. I mean, I knew I wanted to do something different, but I didn't know what it was. So anyway, the long and the short of it was that I decided that it was probably time to start thinking about getting out of there. And my wife she also was a professor, was getting ready to take a sabbatical. And so I figured, well, when she gets ready to do that, I'm going to leave and start devoting more time to musical composition exclusively. Well, again, of course, this whole story that I'm telling you just has one twist after another. At the point that I did leave there, that's when Gerald Youngblood first came out with the SDR 1000. And I mean, that vectored me off in a completely different direction, where suddenly there was a premium on developing some sort of standalone SDR transceiver application that could work with the SDR 2000. And it had some interesting constraints. Namely, it had to be able to work and transmit and receive in half duplex because those were the only kind of sound cards that people had in those days. And it had to be minimal latency, which, again, is extremely difficult on sort of these little computers with sound cards. So it was technically a huge challenge, and that's what led to the development of DTTSP, which was the SDR core for PowerSDR and a bunch of other things. And I should also point out that my partner in crime in a lot of this, because we worked in the same place, was Bob McGwier and 4HY. So a lot of this wasn't exactly joint development. I mean, we kind of did it in parallel. We worked together, but it was more ping-ponging off one another.
Parallel play.
Yeah, sort of. That's right.
Gerald was my guest in episode 57 of the QSO Today podcast.
Right.
That's very interesting. The SDR 1000 was, 2001, 2002 when he did his first paper?
That's right.
Right at the turn of the century, as it were. So that explains then what your association then is with Flex Radio and PowerSDR. Gerald was one of the first out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he came up with this set of boards. And I think I got the third set of boards that he put out, which I have to admit I never really got working properly for reasons I haven't been able to nobody could figure out at the time. But it sort of didn't matter because my attention got diverted much more into working on the software.
Did you and Bob then write the PowerSDR software that Gerald ultimately used?
Yes, that's right. I mean, what happened was basically Bob and I jointly developed the algorithms. I suspect that was probably about a 60-40 thing as far as developing the specific algorithms were concerned. And I did pretty much everything else, which involved a lot of concurrency, a lot of threaded programming, which was a real pain in the neck to get right. And he was continuing with algorithm development and the technology transfer, finding different places for this software to go. So thanks to him, I mean, they were totally outside of PowerSDR. I think it's probably no longer true, but for a long time there were probably 15 or 20,000 installations of DTTSP, which is the SDR core for PowerSDR, that places all over the world. A lot of government sites.
Wow, interesting. Now, PowerSDR wasn't just exclusive to Flex Radio, I think. Wasn't it kind of adapted and used by all of the SDR radios that came along later?
Not all of them, among other things, because PowerSDR was and is a very problematic thing.
Why is that?
Well, for one thing, because it runs on Windows.
Okay. Enough said.
Yeah, no, I mean,
no, I'm kidding.
I can't describe to you the number of headaches that have been engendered in amateur radio SDR by this dependence on Windows. It's from my point of view, it's just been a catastrophe. But there it is.
Well, because it's always I mean, I hate to say this to Windows users, and I am one, and as I told Frank at the beginning of the show before we started recording, I think I've used my last Windows operating system, but I think Windows is always a moving target, isn't it? With every update or something like that?
Yeah, and also, I mean, the simple design of Windows is such that it's anything you need to do that actually has to have minimum guaranteed latency is going to be as difficult a thing as you can possibly do on the operating system, because in order to guarantee maximum responsiveness to the mouse and anything that was appearing on the screen, the stuff that Windows wanted to do with the screen and the mouse and the keyboard took precedence over pretty much everything else that you wanted to do. And they found ways to try and cooperate with the world, but I mean, it's a nightmare for trying to do that kind of programming still to this day.
Now, you told me earlier that you do most of your work on a Macintosh, or no longer a Macintosh, but Apple Mac equipment. Is PowerSDR available in the Mac environment and also in the Linux environment?
Lord, I have no idea. I honestly have no idea. I stopped paying attention to that long ago.
Well, does that mean that you're no longer doing SDR, or are you no longer using PowerSDR as a software to drive your SDR projects?
No, I'm really doing very little technical work of any kind at this point, for the simple reason that the turn that SDR, software-defined radio for amateur purposes, and the development of it, a turn that it took, I don't know, starting about 10 years ago, maybe a little less, was very discouraging to me, and it just kind of squashed all the interest I had in working in the field out completely. I mean, we can get into that later if you want, but even though there are now commercial products which are extremely successful that rely on SDR technology, it seems to me that in the long run they're going to turn out to be as problematic for the development of the field as anything else. I mean, for a lot of people, SDR means at this point basically just having a pan adapter. And if you give them something that has a pan adapter, they're happy. Whereas it became clear very early on to me that the potential for SDR, for software-defined radio and that technology to revolutionize everything about the way amateur radio was done was enormous, and it wasn't even that tough technically. But hams tend to be very conservative, and what's happened is they've tried to squash all of it. Look, it's just like the early automobiles were made to look like horseless carriages. All of the SDR technology has been squashed into something that looks like a conventional radio that just has a nicer user interface on it, which on top of that, most of it has been pushed into firmware, which is understandable for commercial reasons. But essentially what it means is that the total azimuth available for experimentation with any of this stuff is extremely small. I mean, there are only very few people who are doing anything that's even remotely interesting as far as I'm concerned at this point. And I have better things to do with my time.
I thought that the original promise of SDR, and I'm not an SDR user, and it's not because I don't want to, it's just I'm not there yet, but I thought the original promise of SDR, at least for amateur radio, was perhaps the ability to listen and decode and decipher signals in multiple places at the same time. So if you were a contester, for example, you could have your eyes on other bands and opportunities, so you'd have that opportunity to pounce. Am I off base here? Is that...
No. I think you put your finger on... I mean, that's merely one of the more immediate applications of exactly that sort of thing. You're absolutely right. And that's a good application of the kind of background technology that I'm talking about. But it should be... Well, I was talking about synthesizers and how when they originally came out, they were monophonic. In other words, you had a keyboard there that looked like a piano keyboard, but you could only play one note at a time. And then, lo and behold, somebody came up with a way of playing two notes at a time. So the question was, is this an improvement of 100% or 1/88th?
Right, and you have 10 fingers too, so is it an improvement at all?
That's right. So, I mean, that's sort of where we're at. I mean, most of the SDR technology that lets you do anything remotely like what you're describing it's just a fractional improvement, when in fact it should be completely generalizable, and it's not even conceptually that difficult. The fact is that a lot of the people are kind of slow to pick up on sort of what the potential is. Here's another example. Okay. One of the things that it's easiest to do with SDR is to achieve frequency agility. So, for example, frequency hopping spread spectrum, which I'm not necessarily suggesting, but frequency hopping spread spectrum is a triviality with SDR transmission.
And with encryption, frequency hopping spread spectrum with encryption.
Right. But the central issue here is not so much the specific kinds of signals, but the fact that you gain easy frequency agility using SDR. Well, it's also true that with some limitations, you ought to be able to comparably achieve something like time agility, which is to say you ought to be able, to some degree, to look back in time for a signal, so that if you notice something, you're in the middle of a transmission on some channel that's going on, and you say, oh, this looks pretty good, you ought to be able to jump back in time earlier to when this thing started in order to get the entire transmission. Essentially, what you ought to be able to do in SDR is have agility in two dimensions, within limits, obviously. As far as I know, this is potentially a huge problem in user interface design, but from a technological point of view, in terms of actually achieving it, making it possible to do that, it's not a big deal.
So nobody's doing this yet?
Nope. Well, no, I take that back. I take that back. One of the things that I worked on when I was still working in the field was some new applications for the Agilent 3238S broadband surveillance device, RF surveillance device. And what I was working on was the automatic identification of signals, which is another issue. That's something I worked on a lot. But it was sort of you kind of point and click and say, what is this? And it'll tell you out of all the possible signal types in the world, what is it? And one of the things that was necessary for that system, if you really wanted to use it, was to have this big silo that was storing old samples, so that if you found a channel that had something interesting on it, you can go back and say, oh, find the beginning of this, and then offload it for me, record it somewhere. That's actually been an active application in the SIGINT world for a long time. And there's no reason that you can't do it in amateur radio. I mean, absolutely no reason at all. But you mention it to people, and they kind of scratch their heads and they say, what?
Is that Agilent device, is that a headless device, or does it look like Agilent test equipment with a lot of knobs, buttons, and display?
No. It's a fairly big box. It's like the size of an old mini computer with some stuff hanging off it and a really high grade screen and mouse.
One system, one box.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, cool.
Yeah. For that, I worked on a system which would automatically pick out certain kinds of transmitted speech, and flag that for an analyst to look at.
For example, if you're intercepting cellular telephone signals from an enemy country.
Right. Or
even in a friendly country.
Sure. Yes.
Yeah.
And similarly, for example, if you're looking for tactical communications among a bunch of covert operators, and what you do is you essentially set up a schedule for scanning those frequencies, and if certain kinds of voices on certain kinds of FM channels show up because they're using cheap handy talkies, then something's going on.
Oh, that's really cool. You wrote a paper with Bob McGwier, N4HY, who you mentioned earlier, and the paper was called AMSAT Oscar Echo SDR 1000 High-Speed FSK. Now, this is an old paper, and
Yes.
you proposed using an SDR transceiver as a way to work satellites.
Yes.
If one of the listeners, even me, wanted to get into satellites for the first time, can you suggest a route to building the first SDR base station? As a project, rather than maybe going, not to knock anybody's radio, but to going to a commercial vendor and getting the solution.
Okay, absolutely. Unfortunately, I'm forgetting the acronym. I think it's called the Open Research Institute. There's a project that's been put together by Bruce Perrins, K6BP,
Sure.
and Michelle Thompson, W5NYV, which is the goal of this project is to develop a ground station for general use with satellites of all kinds, and it includes, among other things, broadband multi-channel multimedia up and down, and using the DVB standard for modulation. But it'll also do pretty much everything else, and they're actively working on this project. And the core of it uses GNU radio, which I would suggest anybody who's interested in doing some sort of experimentation should start there. Using GNU radio for the software and any number of different hardware interfaces, from that little RTL SDR dongle to all of the RF interfaces from Etis Research and any number of other things. I mean, there are more of them now than you can shake a stick at, but that's absolutely the place to start. I mean, you could put together a simple FM transponder-based SDR station with GNU radio and one of these devices. If you knew what you were doing, you could put it together in a couple days.
For under $200, perhaps.
Possibly. I don't know about
I'm thinking the transmit side might be more, but...
Yeah, you can certainly do the downlink, though. I mean, easily for less than that.
Right, I think those RTL SDR dongles are $20 and less on eBay.
Right. And the software, of course, is completely free. It's totally open source. You do have to run it on pretty much have to run it on Linux, though.
Of course. And what else is there?
Yeah.
for,
Well, for this kind of work,
for us newly converted.
Yeah, no, and for this kind of work, you're kind of nuts to do anything else.
You are associated, or at least I found an association for you, with the Odyssey project and how it might be implemented in ham radio projects. I was thinking of FM or digital mobile radio. Could you talk a little bit about what the Odyssey project is or was and what applications to ham radio it might have?
Well, to tell you the truth, I'm a little vague on the whole thing at this point because this was the stage at which I was starting to exit the field in any big way. I think the more general aspect of it, and this relates directly to what I was saying before about things like time and frequency agility, is actually putting the software out there in the cloud somewhere. Earlier, when we were just talking about this briefly before we started recording, you had raised the question of what do you do about hardware? Well, in some ways, that's easy.
Well, we were talking about a cloud-based SDR receiver, like maybe putting the SDR receiver on a DigitalOcean droplet or something like that.
Yes, that's right. That's right. I'm going to raise a technical issue now, which is extremely important. In some ways, it's kind of the kernel of further SDR development, and that is that the basic design for any SDR device at this point should involve multi-rate processing, which means basically you grab just a big gulp of spectrum all at the same time, extremely broadband, and find a way to selectively extract or re-inject narrowband channels from within that wideband gulp. So it's basically the wideband processing and the channel extraction or insertion that's going on in the cloud. And you say, okay, give me this much spectrum from this time to this time and just feed it to me in real time, please. And I will do the rest of the processing locally. Again, it's pretty obvious to me that this is, for a lot of applications, this is how it ought to be done, that there's some sort of central server that's just doing nothing but sucking in or spitting back out broadband spectrum. And you have a bunch of other applications which can be anywhere, given a network, that what they do is they request specific channels at frequencies and bandwidths to be extracted and sent to them in real time. And it's extremely straightforward.
What's interesting about that question is, for example, if you're putting it on like a DigitalOcean droplet, which is just a company that sells hosted server or hosted desktop service or whatever, also or Amazon AWS. Where do you put the receiver? Can you convince Amazon or these guys to take your SDR receiver and plug it into a port on their server farm? Or do you need to have a very large uplink connection from wherever you put the receiver in order to get that much data into the cloud for processing?
I don't know the answer to that. I mean, it's one of those things that is difficult to answer in principle because there are so many practical considerations involved.
You want the USB port in a data center. Plug the receiver in, right? But if you were doing it from your house on ADSL, then you wouldn't have enough upstream bandwidth in order to give you the desired result, I think, in the cloud.
Yeah, I mean, in practical terms, it's tough because, like, I have a fast downlink to my machine here, just in my apartment. The uplink speed is nowhere comparable to that. So, what you really need, you need a special interface. I mean, again, it's one of the problems actually with consumer machines of any kind, even very high grade ones, for this kind of application, because the limiting factor is always how fast you can get data in and out of the memory of the machine, and that's still not very fast for most consumer machines. So you probably have to do something, at least for the time being, something a little special.
It's a great question to wrap your head around, though.
Yeah, it sure is. It sure is, and in some ways,
it's almost like creating an Internet of Things, IoT devices, IoT SDR receivers planted all over the place, and then kind of aggregating their tiny signals into a large signal. Yes, very much so. That would seem to be the solution for it, and I think you put your finger right on it. Again, that's not an extremely difficult problem. You can do it, and the technical means for taking those
They have to be. Each of the individual channels has to be a little bit oversampled in such a way that when you merge them, you can afford to throw away a little bit of the bandwidth. But you can do that. You can get individual subchannels of various sizes and merge them into one broadband channel, from which you then in turn go and extract subchannels. Yes, that would appear to be the solution at the moment.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA3ON, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. The SETI project, the search for extraterrestrial intelligence, has a screensaver that's used for doing data processing on your computer for SETI while you're not using your computer. Mm-hmm. What an interesting idea that if you could get people to subscribe and take one of these RTL SDR dongles and plug it in with an antenna someplace, that if you get enough of these receivers out there, then you could actually do something very similar where you're actually taking samples from all of these subscribers and then putting it up into the cloud and then doing some real processing to actually see what's happening out there.
Yeah, and it's even just at the level of sort of how much duplication, how much random distribution over the entire spectrum, given the bandwidth of the individual devices. I mean, sort of, how much do you have to overdo it? How much do you have to supersaturate the array of receivers in order to guarantee that you're going to get full coverage pretty much all the time? That in itself is kind of an interesting combinatorial problem, I think. But that's a really good idea. That's a really, really good idea.
So it's out there for any of the listeners to remember QSO Today if you make $1 million. But
right. Well, I have a box that's sitting off my cable modem that does nothing but use sort of unused cycles to constantly monitor what the bandwidth is in and out from my apartment. And these boxes are all over the place here. I don't know whether they're anyplace else, but they're all over the place in Vancouver. And they don't eat much. They just sort of sit there and they sample the bandwidth and they provide a very accurate picture of what the network performance is. It's a little bit like that, I think.
Yeah, I think it could be. I asked you about this at the beginning because I told you that I think I'm on my last Windows operating system, which is Windows 7, that you're not on Windows and that you're using something else. Are you an advocate of any particular kind of development system or operating system, and why is that?
Well, I have nothing. I think I mentioned I have one Linux laptop, which I really don't use for much of anything anymore. Everything else I have runs OS 10 or iOS or something like that, but that's 100% because I spend all of my time using music applications, whether it's sort of an engraving program like Sibelius or a digital workstation, digital audio workstation like Logic. So all of those programs, the best ones and the top-end ones, and the ones that are best suited for my purposes all run on Macs. So that's what I've got. That's what I use. There's really no more thoughtful decision involved than that. But of course, OS 10 is underneath it's Berkeley Unix. So if I need to do something like that, which doesn't happen very often anymore, but if I need to do something like that, it's just like opening the door and being home already.
There's a picture on your GitHub site. Now, unfortunately, you don't have anything posted to your GitHub site, but there is a great picture of a monument or marker with Hebrew at the top and English writing on the bottom that talks about a Philco radio shop on Allenby Street. Can you explain what that is and why it's on your GitHub site?
Yeah, I was in Tel Aviv. It'll be just about 3 years ago. And this is right near the Choco Carmel.
That's the Carmel Market, behind the resort hotels, yeah.
That's right, yeah. I mean, it's just, it's a zoo all the time.
The best hummus, though, in the city.
Absolutely. And I don't know how people can survive on a diet of bowl after bowl of hummus every day, but, that's a different...
But they're looking pretty good, don't you think?
Absolutely.
It's my favorite food. I think I tell people that's why I moved here.
That's a pretty good reason, actually. But in any case, sort of right up on Allenby Street, there's this little monument, and I thought, oh my God! I mean, this was the SIGINT center of early Israel, right here. Just in this tiny shop. So all of my old friends, I think, in that world, I thought were entitled to see sort of what the monument was of and for all of that activity. Sort of right there, out in the open, with no other particular drama associated with it, and that was the hot spot. I mean, that was in some ways aside from the human intelligence, that was the signals intelligence center for early Israel, and for who knows for how long. So I thought it was notable for that reason.
Yeah, Israel history has a lot of interesting radio background. I think in episode 9, I'll have to make sure and put that in the show notes page, I had Amnon Bar Giora, who was the founder of, or one of the founders of the Israel Amateur Radio Club, which is the National Club of Israel, and the Amateur Radio Service in Israel. Mm-hmm. There's a long history with radio, and I think Motorola had its first out-of-country research and development center in Israel in like 1962. So there's a long history.
Yeah. Well, and still to this day. I mean, if you want to buy some sort of, well, like if you want to buy an HF radio for your plane these days that has ALE, I mean, there aren't very many places you can get it, but one of the places you can get it is from Mobat, right? Right.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
What kind of impact has amateur radio had on your family life?
It was very, very direct, actually. I mean, my late wife wasn't particularly happy that I was spending a lot of time in the shack doing this sort of thing. She had mixed feelings about it, and she wasn't entirely crazy about antennas, but she was extremely active physically, and we like to hike and ride bicycles and extended trips and things like that. And when I discovered HF Portable, it's like I developed a new enthusiasm for taking these trips and doing these excursions together. So we wound up doing a lot of things, doing a lot of hikes, going a lot of places for that purpose, which for her were aesthetic and for me were an excuse to do some HF Portable operation. So it was actually pretty good. It worked out very well. She was a lot happier when I was out hiking with her, and she had no problem with my setting up for a while and on the top of a hill somewhere and playing some radio. So it was actually pretty positive.
Now, are you still playing radio with HF Portable?
It's about the only thing I can do because, again, I'm not sure it's clear. I mean, I migrated to Canada in 2010. I've been living in Vancouver. I've been living in Vancouver part-time for a while, but I've been living here full-time since 2014. I have a wonderful apartment which looks straight across at the mountains on the North Shore. I can see all the Olympic sites, which means I have absolutely no coverage southward, and the RF environment here really sucks. It's just really bad. So about the only thing I can do is HF Portable at this point.
And what's your HF Portable rig?
I use one of two FT817s, and sometimes a manual tuner, sometimes automatic. I have an 857, which I run at low power sometimes. It's been the same thing I've used for a long time. For quite a while, what I used it mostly for was doing QRP Portable for the VHF UHF contests, which is something that I really, really enjoy doing. Thinking about getting a KX2, but unlike a lot of people, I find the VHF UHF coverage to be very important. I like it a lot. So it's nothing very complicated. I'm just in the process also of getting a new car, so I think I might have a mobile rig where I can actually take down the antenna and things like that. It's pretty simple. But it's just too noisy to operate at home.
Do you operate SOTA or radar or any of those contests?
I actually was originally involved in trying to get SOTA to expand into North America, which it didn't at the time. And I would now, too, except my knees kind of won't let me do the climbing anymore, which is sad. I would really love to do it because the peaks around here are fabulous. So what I'm hoping to do is I'm hoping to do some more IOTA operation, especially from the Haida Gwaii and some of the Gulf Islands here just off Vancouver.
Right. My father lives near Port Angeles, so he's looking out across the Puget Sound towards Vancouver and Vancouver Island. Yeah. It's a beautiful area, and certainly with IOTA, which is islands on the air, there's a lot of islands to work in there.
Boy, there are, and it's surprising how few of them have had much activation at all, considering how easy they are to get to. So I'm kind of rubbing my hands and sort of keeping it to myself.
So are you thinking of doing IOTA by canoe or something like that? It would kind of be like summits on the air, except you'd save your knees.
Yeah, absolutely. I happen to like ocean-going kayaking quite a bit, although I haven't done it in a while, and that always seemed to be an ideal way to go to sort of combine those things. Although my wife, I was telling you about that we did a lot of these activities together. We started an ocean kayaking tour together, and she found herself incapable of steering the damn thing, so we got kicked off the tour. So I think it's something I'll have to pursue myself at this point. But yeah, that's very appealing.
What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
Right at this very moment, I think, and again, this has to do with the ground station project that I was describing before with W5NYV and K6BP.
Mm-hmm.
You're getting a lot of people who are in the position to make serious technical contributions to what will be, I think, commonplace amateur activity. A lot of people who weren't really technically involved in the hobby before. It's kind of like, the effect that Joe Taylor had,
right?
By
with the digital modes.
Yes, yeah. Exactly, right. Well, imagine that kind of squared. In terms of the different kinds of activity that become possible when you have like broadband digital modulation schemes available with relatively inexpensive rigs. I mean, both terrestrially and to satellites. I mean, the potential for it is extraordinary. And there's some awfully smart people who are coming in. And also the other thing, this is just sort of my hobby horse, but I'm really, really happy that there are so many people who are not merely expressing an interest, but actually acting on the desire to learn CW, even they don't have to.
It is kind of amazing, isn't it? It seems that I think there's more people learning CW now or operating CW now than before when CW was required.
Yeah, when they had to do it, it was unappealing. But yeah, no, very much so. I kind of miss some of the old high-speed operators. I mean, that was something else entirely. And what was interesting, I thought, was that the high-speed CW operators had almost a unique dialect of English because the way you hear slow-speed ops or slower-speed ops, and this is not a criticism, this is just sort of a historical fact. I mean, people tend to spell things out, and they tend to use punctuation. And, the old high-speed guys, I mean, there were only two forms of punctuation. There was a comma, which they would use sort of while they were thinking of what to say next, and, the BT, the break, and that was it. It was just a very different conversational style, and I kind of miss that. It's sad that you don't hear it much anymore. Well,
but it seems to be with groups like CW Ops, which are working on, bringing CW operators in, that could be the Ph.D. program for CW Ops. That some of those, what I'm saying is that you're bringing people in and you want to get to the high-speed style. I know that that the Europeans have a whole international contest of high-speed CW operation, which appears to be that they're just using code oscillators and they're not doing it on the air, but there's a lot of people learning Morse code and doing it at very high speeds.
Yeah.
I guess that we should figure out a way to get them on the radio.
That would be terrific, actually, if you could do that.
I don't know.
It was sort of a surprise. Kind of a long story, but it turns out that the building that I live in, the building manager, I mean, she's a terrific woman, but it turns out her husband is this like really big league Canadian contester. And
ham radio contester?
Yeah, right, right. I mean, he's originally Serbian and moved here, and I mean, this guy is really kind of amazing as far as that sort of thing is concerned. Apparently, he's sort of a legendary figure. So I always sort of figured two things. That first of all, if I ever really worked up my nerves, she might be willing to let me put an antenna up on the roof. And also, apparently this guy's station is also amazing, so I'd love to have a look at it and just kind of watch him in operation sometime, because he's
It's in the Vancouver area?
Yeah, that's right.
The landlady doesn't live in the building. She's
not anymore. She has they have an office and an apartment here, but they don't live here anymore. No.
Oh, I see. Oh, that's too bad. Well, I guess you'll have to get the nerve at some point and
right,
and see what you can do.
After I get my refrigerator replaced, then I'll start talking.
What advice would you give to newer returning hams?
Oh, just jump in. Spend more time listening than you do talking. Spend a lot of time just listening to what's going on in the HF bands, and devote a weekend just to sit there and listening to what happens during contests, and how that all works. And do field day, and just do a lot of different things, and don't get stuck on repeaters or think that that's representative of anything other than a tiny, tiny fragment of the activity. But just listen. Copy people doing PSK on 30 meters. I mean, just do all of this stuff and see what the activity actually is. And from that, decide where you want to position yourself. It's such an easy thing to do.
Especially with an SDR receiver.
Yep.
For example.
That's right.
Yeah. For
example. Yep.
Frank, you've been a wonderful guest. I really appreciate your coming on the QSO Today podcast.
Oh, Eric, it's been great.
With that, I'll wish you 73.
Very good. And happy holidays.
Thank you. That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Frank. Please be sure to check the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday and put in AB2KT in the search box at the top of the page. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing on the subscribe buttons on the show notes page. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages. Your value for value support is recognized on the QSO Today podcast and in the weekly show notes. Use our Amazon link when you shop on Amazon. Clicking on this link before you enter Amazon will allow Amazon to pay us a small commission on what you purchase. This is a very painless way to support the QSO Today podcast. QSO Today is syndicated on every podcast platform, including Spotify and the iTunes Store. Until next time, this is Eric 4Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.